Well, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to a policy webinar which the Panelists is bringing together in association with PA Consulting ahead of the LGA conference up in Harrogate, North Yorkshire next week. The title of this event is Creating the Local Innovation State. Huge need to grow the economy in all the right ways, and with today's headline news about record levels of inflation at a 40-year high, we clearly need it more than ever. So in order to address this issue, we have brought together a strong panel of experts, economists, to debate the issues from the prism of place. And against kind of what we have, the mounting tide of rapid economic, environmental and social pressures, and clearly in terms of the legislative agenda, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. So the essay question we're seeking to answer today is, to what extent is it possible to spark, at the level of place, a decade of ingenuity to resolve some of the complex, entrenched and multi-layered problems we have, and to transform the poison of unproductive areas of the economy into the medicine of turbocharged growth that delivers for people and places. So that's what we're going to do between now and 12 o'clock. So that's kind of the general background to our debate. How can we create the local innovation state? What's really driving this is clearly it's so well rehearsed. It doesn't need any more rehearsals. No, we're not good as a nation at sharing or diffusing the fruits of our research. Graphene in Manchester being the textbook example of that, either for industrial adoption or for creating solutions to specific problems. So as one of the levelling up priorities, we're looking at seeking to match investment in things like manufacturing technology with place, and we've got the new innovation accelerators in Greater Manchester, the West Midlands and Glasgow to do this. And another stated aim of the Levelling Up white paper is that in terms of changing the economic geography of the country is to change the funding flows. So R&D spend is going to be prioritised outside of the Oxfam London nexus to other parts of the country, and we're looking to boost R&D investment outside the Greater South East by at least 40% by 2030. So we've set this, our expert panelists today. We've got Joe Lappin, Chief Executive of Cumbria Local Economic Partnership. Great pleasure to have Vicky Price, the renowned economist and business consultant. From our event partners, Conrad Thompson, Senior Partner at PA Consulting. And finally, when we looking back in, Professor Chris White, Director of Industrial Policy Research Centre at Loughborough University. So that's kind of the programme for today. What I will do in terms of the order we're going to be running, the house rules, this is being run as a webinar, so we can't see you, but certainly we would encourage, after each of the panelists in the order I set has given us 5 minutes of what they see as being most pertinent and relevant to creating the local innovation state. We'll invite members of the debate. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. If you can't follow instructions, put them in the text box, but the Q&A box is where we'd like to see them. And we will encourage debate between amongst the panelists to address this question, how we go about creating the local innovation state. So for expert panelists, great privilege to have them. In terms of the running order today, we're going to keep it local to start with, but we're going to invite Joe Lappin, followed by Conrad, followed by Chris, and bringing up the tail to give a global perspective, Vicky Price. So them's the rules. We look forward to an exciting debate with you. And if I could kindly ask Joe to unmute, I will spotlight you and take it away. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And what I want to talk about today is the innovation experience in my own LEP area, Cumbria. For those not familiar with Cumbria, we have 3 sectors where we have a greater concentration than national average. Advanced manufacturing, which makes up 23% of our economic value. Our visitor economy and associated sectors, we attract 45 million visits per annum. And we're the home of both the Lake District and Hadrian's Wall World Heritage Sites. And finally, our rural economy. We've got one of the largest dairy, beef herds and lamb flocks in the country. So for us, we're also world leaders in civil and defence nuclear. So an interesting and diverse economy. I would go as far as saying we are polycentric, but I'm sure Vicky might challenge me on that one. So we can't start without recognising the current national economic realities. Inflation, 40-year high, increasingly fragmented supply chains, many of our business facing acute labour supply challenge. Additionally, our productivity challenges are well documented and we haven't been making up any ground. So in my own area, productivity performance from 2015 to 2019 actually moved backwards. And it's against this backdrop that we're really looking to encourage our businesses to invest in innovation. So we in Cumbria have been really fortunate in that we've received funding from the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, or as we all know it, EPSRC, to complete a project to explore our innovation ecosystem, the level of existing activity, and what support our businesses need to innovate. And this really matters in Cumbria, as looking at any proxy measure for innovation, we underperform. And we don't naturally benefit from the features that tend to drive innovative geographies. We don't have a young, diverse population. We don't have significant high-end research institutions. We don't have spin-out infrastructure. So in the absence of these, we really wanted to understand what catalyses innovation and what more we might do to foster this. The research project helpfully reinforced what we already knew. And it told us that we have an exceptional, deep but narrow innovation ecosystem around the nuclear sector and nuclear engineering, especially in decommissioning. And large organisations such as the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, National Nuclear Laboratory and Sellafield, alongside specialist firms and academic institutions in Cumbria, work collectively on this. This ecosystem extends way beyond local. It is really regional, national and global. We've also got really strong islands of innovation built around single firms who are globally competitive and specialists in their fields. They have excellent relationships with universities in the UK that deal with the specialism. We've got lots of individuals and firms who have and are developing excellent innovative ideas, but operate largely in isolation and really struggle to have the time to link and find out what's happening in the world of innovation. What drives innovation? Really positive. People want to increase sales, quality and profitability. It also emphasised the importance of individuals. A personal, professional interest in innovation is critical to success. And we also identified 5 categories of innovators. One-off innovators, and for speed I will say, did it once, rested on the laurels and it's delivering results. Revolutionary innovators, looking at new products, services or ideas and moving those forward. Willing but struggling innovators, small or medium-sized firms who know they need to innovate, but they're really struggling to actually find the time to be able to do it. They're held back. Core innovators, These are the businesses where it's a way of life for them. They are constantly looking to address complex situations with innovative solutions. And then strategic innovators, large firms that rely heavily on technological innovation to remain at the cutting edge of their business. They're typically global in nature with really good R&D capability and facilities. So importantly, we wanted to know what gets in the way for businesses. Time, as you would expect, businesses are increasingly time poor. Money, cash reserves depleted, innovation's risky. How do we justify the expenditure? Knowledge and expertise, where do we go? Who helps us? And finally, working with HEIs. Different expectations around pace, unrealistic resource expectations on businesses, knowing where to go, intellectual property considerations, and a lack of goal alignment. So they're the issues, and our focus in creating our own local innovation ecosystem is very much about how do we support more businesses to innovate. And our focus, therefore, is on both the one-off and the willing but struggling innovators, commonly known as the long tail. So in terms of moving forward, we're doing three things: repurposing existing loan funds to deliver innovation and decarbonisation grants, creating our own peer networks, bringing together our partners, including would-be innovators, existing innovators, and HEIs. And we're also looking at what will be the rocket boosters to innovation locally by securing innovation catalysts. And I'm shamelessly plugging, we are now in the last 5 for the siting of the spherical tokamak for energy production, STEP, which is a fusion prototype commercial power plant. And that would absolutely be a global catalyst for innovation. So in closing, if we're to deliver on the ambition of levelling up mission 2, we'll all need to create our own local innovation ecosystem that are absolutely designed around our own economies. Thank you very much.
Jo, many thanks indeed for really setting the scene so beautifully, describing the local innovation state in Cumbria so well, and good, very topical given the news today on the energy from waste story. That's very good timing indeed. So moving on, I'm going to invite Conrad, when you look ready, I'm going to place you on the spotlight. Let's please hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I thought that was super, Jo, and certainly there's some connections in terms of what I'm going to cover off next. So really delighted to be here. My name is Conrad Thompson, senior partner at PA. We have a clear purpose as a consultancy, which is to bring ingenuity to life. And as a former board director, I'm on a real mission to see how we can drive innovation and R&D in the public sector. So that's why I'm particularly interested in joining this call today. So I think, as both Jonathan and Jo have laid out, the challenges and opportunities here are pretty clear. It was really nicely summed up, actually, in an article in The Economist yesterday, which I quote said, "Britain is a great place to start a company, but a bad one to scale it up." And if you look at that article, it talked in particular about funding issues, but it's one in a series that The Economist are running all around the blockers to scaling up innovation. And for me, that's the fundamental challenge that we need to address. So as we know, government's aspirations here are huge: to become a scientific superpower, get 2.4% of investment in R&D by 2027, and a huge increase in funding, 60 billion over the next 3 years, to the point that by 2026-7, we'll be at 22 billion pounds a year investment in innovation and R&D. Just to put that in context, the entire defence budget is just over double that. So our entire Army, Navy, Air Force security, we're spending half of all of that money on innovation and R&D. But the issue is, that if we don't get better at leveraging that, there's a real risk that that extra money, that extra investment will just fall on fallow ground. And as Joe cited, will continue to be in the slow lane when it comes to scaling up and productivity, and all of the stats show that is currently the case. So what I wanted to talk to you today in particular about was a piece of research that we've recently completed with BASE on the Innovation, Adoption and Diffusion Challenge. So how can the UK get better, not just at the research end, which is hugely important, but at the adoption and diffusion of innovation? We've completed the report. It's going to be published at the end of July. But rather than me talking kind of facts and figures and frameworks, which consultants have a tendency to do, I'm going to tell you about two stories. So the first story is about someone called Andrew. Andrew's a postgrad and entrepreneur, great ideas of a breakthrough innovation. His mother also works in the city, so was able to give him seed funding. And he was well on the way to launching his new product. But wind forward 2 years and he's stuck. He's worn out his university and research network, is struggling to find an anchor customer, and other than a few generic network events, great as they are, there is little more the local council is doing to really help him other than supportive words. So unfortunately, the likelihood is he's going to join a big corporate, run out of the US. Now let me introduce you to Tasha, also a postgrad with a leaning towards being an entrepreneur, which runs in her family. Her idea is aligned to a strategic focus in a local place. And that local authority has made a long-term commitment to be a leader in her market area. So she moved to that place and rolled her sleeves up. Almost immediately, the virtuous circle started working. She met colleagues with a deep interest in her area, found businesses who wanted to work with her company, and some new investors. And also the local council really helped to get through some tough regulatory hurdles to scale up her product. 2 years on, she's in Series B funding and lining up for an international launch, and is now coaching others who have come to the area with their business ideas and skills. She's also established a local apprenticeship scheme focused at further education colleges, and through that has got some really great talent coming into the company. So what's the difference between these two stories, between Andrew and Tasha? And our review is, it's pretty simple actually, and it is what the report concludes. That government, and often our thinking, is what we call left to right thinking, where we look to invest in a particular technology and push that into the market. And that's fine for early research, the thing that we are globally known for. But it quickly stumbles at the point you need to scale. And what scaling needs is right to left thinking, where there is a wide collective view on the priority for growth and alignment of a whole ecosystem behind that. And it's that right to left thinking that place-based organizations are ideally and arguably uniquely placed to lead. Joe's talked about, I think, some really interesting areas around that, and certainly the rocket boosters around fusion, I think, is a perfect example. I'll give you one other, more from the south of the country rather than the Midlands and the north, which is Plymouth County Council. So some of you may be aware that they, a number of years ago, sought to develop a disused MOD land to bring together marine-based businesses to create a world-class hub for marine industries, with opportunities for research, innovation, education, and production. They did a 10 million investment to build a business hub, and then they're now currently on phase 3, which will see the development of a 2,400 metre marine and defence innovation centre. Through this, they've had great engagement from the universities, not just Plymouth, but also Exeter. They've engaged businesses such as Babcock, Relay Engineering, and ESL Group, and other government bodies such as the Marine and Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. So they've established momentum. And for example, now they have recently established a 5G ocean-based marine testbed, which is one of the first in the world to do 5G testing. So what's the conclusion from this? Well, it's clear that innovation matters. But to make innovation matter, you need to start with an overall outcome you are seeking to achieve and bring together the full range of stakeholders to establish an innovation supply chain that will deliver that outcome. Handing back to you, Jonathan.
Many thanks indeed for that, Conrad. I'm now going to ask Professor Chris White, Director of the Industrial Policy Research Centre at Loughborough and a friend of the Cardiffs from all your support on our social value report last year. Chris, it'd be very good to hear from you, your take on how we create the local innovation state. Over to you.
Jonathan, thank you for inviting me to join this, what I think is sort of fundamental to the way we do things. I mean, Conrad's already talked about, scientific superpower. We could add on sort of global Britain, levelling up strategies, etc., and not forgetting Joe talking about the business of working with our SMEs to make sure that they're scaling up before, the attention that we need to give that in terms of levelling up is so important and shouldn't be underestimated. Alongside Loughborough University, I also work with the MTC, the Manufacturing Technology Centre, which is part of the high value manufacturing catapult based in Coventry. Our business really is turning research, developing research, commercialising research, making that ready for our factories to turn into products that they can sell and we can export for the good of the whole. We've been around just over 10 years, from a quarter cabin to now 100 million operation, employing nearly 1,000 people. The point of that's not a sort of sales pitch. The point of that is that there is clearly an appetite for what we do. There's an appetite from academia on one side to industry on the other side. We are the bridge across the valley of death. And that goes very much for the other catapult networks as well. I think what helps us, or what is important, is that we're in the West Midlands. We are certainly trying, and I know Joe is doing an amazing job, and other LEPs across the country. We believe that the West Midlands is really the innovation region. This is why we're pitching for things like ARIA, the Advanced Research Invention Agency, making sure that things like that can operate as some kind of catalyst, not only to benefit the West Midlands, as Joe says very eloquently, regionally, nationally, globally. We need to make the impression that we are part of an innovation strategy. Very much in terms of new sectors, we're established in terms of defence and aerospace, but the new sectors, how we reshore, whether it's our supply chains or production, sectors like the textiles industry, where we were once a global leader. I mean, that is looking some time back, but until we introduce or reintroduce automation, robotics, systems integration into some of these sectors, we're always going to be at a disadvantage. I think some of the shocks we've experienced, whether that's COVID, whether that's Brexit, and even the tragedy that's happening in Ukraine, has made us start to rethink what we mean by innovation. I'm sitting in Cambridge at the moment. We're talking about industrial strategies, and one of the things that I think is sort of evident is that we're not good at strategies, not good at industrial strategies. For example, we're part of the Innovation Accelerator. Birmingham is an element, Manchester is an element, and Glasgow is an element. Now, it's great to be part of that, but each city is having in the region of 30 million worth of funding. 30 million, is that going to change the way we do things? Is that going to open up new sectors? Is that going to give the impetus that things like med tech, clean tech can can deliver. In terms of 2.4% R&D, I mean, it'd be great if we had that. It'd be great if we have that now. I just see some of these things slipping into the distance. I think we need to, bearing in mind there'll be elections in presumably less than 2 years. We need to be fully focused on, what I would envisage something in this 59 years ago that Harold Wilson was talking about the white heat of technology. I mean, maybe that we have come full circle, that we can start to rebuild our reputation, our global reputation, as a place where innovation happens. Where we have gone wrong in the past is innovation has happened here, but the production has happened elsewhere. And I think we need to make sure that we are better prepared to reap the rewards of our excellent, globally respected universities and research institutes like the MTC. I think we cannot have, sort of concluding my remarks, but we can't really have an innovation nation unless we have the skills to do that. And I think our universities, our FE colleges, and our schools need to be reviewing curriculum and making sure that there's greater preparedness for the future of work, which is going to change so dramatically over the next 5 to 10 years, but strategies are definitely needed. Two last things. One, I think we do need to have a manufacturing strategy, and I think an innovation strategy should be hung off that. Manufacturing is where we obviously plays an important part in our GDP, in our jobs, in our quality of life, and for that matter, the cost of living crisis. And finally, I think where we need to develop is a better understanding of our local industrial strategies, making sure that we have clusters of innovation that are springing up based on our technologies, based on developments in things like graphene and things like nanotechnology, right across the country, where our local industrial strategies can be complementary to our regions. But that's really it from me. I will hand you back to Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Many thanks indeed for Chris, and excellent overview and that great metaphorical bridge across the valley of death. That was one thing. Now our final speaker, it will be Vicky Price. Needs no introduction. Very grateful indeed to have you today, and you're going to give a more global perspective on this local innovation issue. So please, Vicky, we'd be delighted to hear from you.
Thank you very much. I agree with everything has been said, particularly in the need to have proper industrial strategy. And yes, it's true there are lots of bits that this government has produced which you can put together, but we need to always be watching out in terms of consistency. And the Levelling Up white paper is also welcome, but indeed one needs to see the extent to which it's actually finally or will be implemented. And of course, it reminded me just looking at this, and yes, I know you want to talk about the global thing, but I was working for the government at the time when we had the public service agreements with lots of targets over a period of time, and we had to keep them, and I was responsible for one of them, and that was the productivity PSA. All that, of course, was dismantled, as were the RDAs, the regional development agencies, and we went backwards. So there is a lot of catching up to do. And one of the facts that we have to put up with is that if we compare us globally, we're still seeing that output per hour is something like 15% below where the US, Japan, sorry, not Japan any longer, Japan has fallen behind, France and Germany are. So we have really not made huge progress, and our productivity performance really since the financial crisis and beyond has been a lot worse than was the case before in terms of what was happening on an annual basis. But we have a real problem right now. Not only do we need to reverse all this, but we also actually don't quite know what's happening. We have had a productivity indicator that showed that productivity fell in the first quarter of 2022, but it was up on a year-on-year basis, if you compare it actually with pre-pandemic, by about 1.9%. A lot of the period of COVID has completely distorted the basis from which we can make these estimates. And this isn't just us, but it is also the case in quite a lot of other countries. So there is a measurement issue that we need to be aware of, and we need to reassess. We have a different set of capabilities in the economy right now. Various regions have been affected in different ways. I mean, obviously at a time of COVID, when everything was closed down, you know, the manufacturing sector closed down as well. It sort of picked up a lot faster than some of the other sectors like services. But the interesting thing is that that is a sector which is most affected right now by supply constraints. This has affected different regions in different ways, depending on the composition of industry that we have in those places. So you may in some cases be starting from a much lower base. So when you're looking at all this leveling up and all this redistribution of R&D spending into various different regions and away from perhaps the greater Southeast, then you need to be aware that perhaps the cost of achieving that improvement might actually be considerably greater. On the other hand, when you look at R&D spending, the level of R&D spending seems to be particularly beneficial for regions that have, and should be, that have greater instances of manufacturing production being there, knowledge-based sectors being there, a number of the sort of high-tech industries that are out there which can benefit from this. So R&D can be quite useful in that area. But again, looking at the data, you see that the vast majority of R&D spending by businesses, the government is trying to change that, of course, but by businesses has tended to be in the greater Southeast. And that hasn't really changed significantly. But of course, we've also seen that business investment has suffered. And if you look at where we are now in terms of business investment, we're something like 9% below where we were at pre-pandemic levels. So again, a real push needs to be made. But for the other sectors that, or in the other regions too, which are not particularly strong in the areas that I mentioned that benefit from actual R&D spending, it's all the other factors that have been mentioned already by everyone, which have to do with product and process innovation. And then, of course, the possibility of being able to scale up and use those innovations in a way that can be developed into something that contributes to the GVA of a gross value added of a particular region. But I did mention some problems about data. And although we look at, for example, the importance of universities in establishing those types of clusters, if you like, from which you can all benefit. The interesting thing is that because multinational firms can perhaps do a little bit of their innovation using Loughborough University, for example, and collaborating, they can then develop it somewhere else. They can do some of the research here, but then develop it somewhere else. The evidence suggests that it's more SMEs that benefit from strong university base in a particular region, which is really important. And we need to bear that in mind in terms of ensuring that when we're talking about encouraging firms to locate in various places, mainly multinational firms, you need to really be worried a lot more about the ability of the ecosystem that Joe mentioned at the beginning to benefit from this. So you need to have quite a lot of SMEs in the supply chain, local ones that can benefit, and encourage them to work in that way so that you can get the most out of this. We also know, of course, that access to finance is seriously important, and venture capital attraction to the various regions is going to be also significant. And this is one area where some data exists, and that's where I want to just focus my remaining remarks, because what happens at European level is that there's quite a lot of attempt, and forgive me for this, I will have to switch that off. Right. There is, as we know, an indicator that the European Commission puts together, which is a European Innovation Scoreboard, and there is also a Regional Innovation Scoreboard. And what people who put this analysis together, and this is the latest one that I have looked at, find that quite a lot of what we don't know and we don't have in terms of regional statistics is things like, if you try and compare us across, doctorate graduates per thousand of population aged between 25 and 34. I'm saying that this is important because when we were doing all the analysis about what matters in terms of regional productivity, what we found was retention of graduates in an area was hugely significant. In other areas where there's no regional data as such, is the percentage of postgraduate students over graduates overall. So that's another factor in terms of the skills. When you look at the types of investments, I already mentioned venture capital expenditure as a percentage of GDP in those regions is very difficult to get information on. So if you're trying therefore to sort of compare yourself with other regions across Europe and see, you know, where is it exactly that you can learn something and what you should perhaps be aiming to counter in terms of improving your own position, then it is quite difficult, and we need a lot more regional statistics there. And then so the final thing, nevertheless, that you can see in terms of differences that exist between the Europeans, for example, and us in this area, is that if you look at even if it is R&D spending in the regions, which, as I said, affects particular sectors more than others, and you try and compare how we're doing by comparison to global OECD R&D spending, what you find is that in the UK, you have only 6 out of 41 sub-regions that the OECD looks at operating above OECD averages, and all the rest operate way below OECD averages. So this is a 15% only of the regions. If you look at Germany, which of course has more manufacturing than we do, so it's perhaps not an absolutely fair comparison, they have 16 of their 38 sub-regions operating above the OECD average, and that is of course 42% over the overall. So there is a long way to go, but we also need to understand the statistics a lot more, and in particular what we need to understand is what can stay in the region. And even if we measure, for example, what is spent by big firms in London or registered in London or their headquarters in London, that itself of course can be quite regional, but being able to disaggregate that is vitally important. And I know a lot of work is being done on this, but if we are to therefore look at the strategy that exists at present, the innovation strategy, the levelling up strategy, and make sure that we end up with the right results, we need to understand what is actually going on and measure things appropriately. Thank you very much.
Vicky, many thanks indeed for that very powerful, persuasive overview of where things are, and thank you to all our panelists. I think we've had a very cohesive overview from each individual contribution. So now we're going to fill up the rest of the hour, 20 minutes for questions to the panel. If you could kindly throw them into the Q&A box or the text box, if you can find that. Chair's privilege, and I've very much taken what you were saying at the end, Vicky, about statistics, the ability to clearly look, if the binary choices, we continue as a relatively stagnation nation, unable to forge across the valley of death, or become an innovation nation, we need to, we can't measure our way to economic success, but clearly from the pre-publication briefing of the Levelling Up white paper, Andy Haldane was extremely insistent that one thing he found very perplexing and annoying in getting the white paper written was all this, going around to the regions, lots of soft intelligence, but a dearth of the hard economic and the analytical data needed to make strong investment cases and decisions. So before I pluck out what we've got in our question box, any sort of further thoughts or comments from any of the panelists about a better use of data, and what would be the ideal way of collecting data locally, which makes sense to BEIS, to Treasury, in a way to direct investment to where it's needed to, first and foremost, Joe, your hand's up first, so I will throw it over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I mean, I think from our perspective, we take data extremely seriously in terms of understanding our economy and measuring what's happening. I'm very, very fortunate. I've got a wonderful economist. I've also got a really, really good senior researcher, and the quality of the information that they provide is excellent. I would absolutely support Vicky's point. Unless you know exactly where you are, it's very difficult to know that you're doing the right things. I also think we need to be realistic in terms of the time scales which some measures, economic measures, move at, because, you know, productivity, we're always a few years out of date. So for us, that's got to be supplemented by local research, surveys, tests, so that we can monitor movement in real time. So I do think most places have got some really, really good intelligence. It's how do we make sure that we are measuring things consistently, measuring the same things, but we're also using that to inform national pieces of work. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed. Anyone else want to take up on this from amongst the panel? The answer might be no.
I would suggest that if Andy Haldane in his position, in his new position, might be well placed to fix some of these problems. And if we're going to be looking at local industrial strategies, which I think are, you know, really the blueprint of how we deliver levelling up, I think data. I mean, clearly Joe is pleased with, or, you know, happy with what she's getting. I mean, what we have in the Midlands Engine, Midlands Observatory, very good bodies for picking these things up. But I do think they're very patchy in terms of performance. We do rely very much on our local authorities to, you know, pull something out of the hat to deliver on some of these things. And I think it's quite a significant challenge, probably more so than we think at the moment.
Many thanks indeed. Chris and Conrad, you've got your hand up, please.
I just also wanted to pick up the points in the chat about social value. I mentioned the Bayes report that we've done and will be completed. We developed, as you kind of expect, a bit of a framework around that, talking about behavioural, economic, social and technical factors, so the kind of best model. And I agree that although there are indicators out there, the European one that Vicky's mentioned, there's also a United Nations worldwide innovation index. Our view is that doesn't cover all of the dimensions that you actually need to drive that development end of research and development. So we think it needs to have aspects around behavioural, social and technical, as well as economic.
Can I quickly come back and just say to Conrad, I was pleased to be the author of the Social Value Act. We now think it influences something in the region of 100 billion of public spending. We need to shift that across to have the same level of adoption by the private sector. But I'm pleased to also see that it is part of the levelling up agenda. It's recognised to actually have an influence on sort of how we pull all our regions up. But Conrad, if you want to have a chat about it sometime, I'd be delighted to do so.
Can I add something?
Please come in, Vicky.
Just because since we're talking about the social issues, thinking again about the inequalities that there may be between regions. As we know, if you just look at, you mentioned the inflation figures right at the very beginning, Jonathan, and which have come out and are very high. And of course, we've also seen the wage figures, which are not very high in real terms across the economy. But the interesting thing is that there is also this gap that is developing, where you have private sector pay going up a lot and public sector pay not so much. But even within the private sector, what you find is that it is areas such as finance and business services. And I'm sorry, since we have consultants also in this panel, where you're getting above above inflation increases, so getting real increases, whereas in loads of other sectors, despite the fact, of course, everyone is suffering equally, you get a lot less of a rise. So, and given that a lot of those sectors that I mentioned are in the southeast, London and the southeast, I just worry that therefore the sort of effort that we need to make for this levelling up, we all agree that it needs to happen, might need to be to counter some of the social concerns that we're bound to have as we come out of this if that trend continues. So that's an extra dimension, and that needs to probably be taken care of.
Many thanks, Vicky, and thanks for addressing that. Well, let's have a dip into what's in the Q&A. Taking on that theme, go to Mike Riddle's question first, to touch upon what Conrad and Chris were discussing. When designing policies to address regional inequalities, should we take intangible assets such as the formation of social capital more seriously? One of the good bits of the Levelling Up white paper was the way it analysed and delineated various forms of capital as means of addressing productivity and inequality. But any thoughts or views on that? And there's a related question you might want to dip into from John Preston, who talks about, what about innovation in the local public sector, particularly for the delivery of services like transport, social care? Do we see the challenges of the local public sector as being different, and how might we support local public sector innovation? So anyone want to come in on either social capital or local public sector innovation?
To Matthew's question, if it is Matthew, Mike, my apologies. Yes is the answer. We do need to include social capital. When we had the first review of the Social Value Act in 2015 by Lord Young, he said there were 3 areas where we needed to make progress. One was awareness, the second was understanding, but the third was measurement. I think we've come a long way on all 3 of those, but to measure social capital can be done in parts, but not in its entirety. But my defence is that it's taken us many thousands of years to develop the accounting structures we have at the moment. The Social Value Act has only been around for a decade or so, so give us some time.
Many thanks, Chris. Joe, you've got your hand up, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. I wanted to come back on John's question on public sector innovation. And I think to some extent there is a different approach that's required in the public sector, because the drivers for public and private are very, very different. And I think we need to remember the things that we learn and somehow in the UK tend to forget very quickly. So I was involved in a national public service transformation pilot, community budgets that some of you may or may not remember. But that was very, very much about rewiring public services to make them more efficient, more effective, and to meet customer requirements so that they were genuinely customer responsive. And there were huge amounts of lessons that were learnt during that process. I think the kind of things that became apparent to me coming from central government to local government is I would get 120 people in a room, 10 people sitting around each table, all of whom would be working for different organisations, claiming to do a variation on the same job. And clearly we're doing those things. There was something about how did that integrate. There was also, we did some radical thinking workshops. How do you really rethink things from start to end? Because people were very, very clear about the world they were currently in. And if you're in a world that is absolutely about this, it makes it slightly more difficult to think about things in a very, very different way. So I think there's lots of things that we could be doing with colleagues in the public sector to say, how do we innovate some of our services and make them deliver the things I've said, efficient, effective, and customer responsive. Thanks.
Many thanks, Joe. Thanks for that nice reminder on community whole place budgets. Conrad, what's your take on all this?
I'll pick up just firstly on the social capital, then talk a bit about public sector. On the social capital, I mean, the one comment I would make is the government's strategy of encouraging any public procurement to have at least 10% of the evaluation based on social value, I think has made genuinely a huge difference. You know, being very candid, when private sector firms are now evaluating bids and price might be 20% and social value can sometimes be 15%, that really casts a very different focus on priorities and how you present your offer to those opportunities. So I just wanted to remind people that 10% is really great, and I'd love to see more of it, candidly, and even going up to 15%, which some government departments do. On the innovation in public sector, I think that's a huge missed opportunity for us at the moment. And candidly, I think, and Joe, you were sort of touching on it to some degree, I think it starts with leadership. My sense is the appetite to innovate in the public sector is generally lower than in the private sector. It's almost seen as you couldn't possibly spend time wasting your effort and public sector money on innovation. It seems a higher bar or hurdle to get over to justify R&D and innovation in the public sector, which is very counterintuitive given how much the government wants to drive innovation, and surely the public sector should be leading on that, not following private sector. That isn't to say great things don't happen in the public sector. I have seen brilliant innovations, but as a whole, it is far less. There's a lower appetite to innovate, in my view, and that's the start point.
Many thanks, Conrad. Vicky, please come in.
I think that's a very good point Conrad was just making, but just to say again that there is an issue also of how do you calculate, measure the impact of whatever innovation there is in the public sector. And indeed, I think there is a huge possibility to innovate, and we've seen some amazing stuff happening anyway. But a lot of what is not calculated in terms of productivity in the public sector is those social outcomes, if you like, what the result is of doing things in a different way for the longer term performance. You know, if you're just thinking about education or even housing and what it actually means for students in the longer term and achievements. So those are very rarely put into any of the calculations of changing things in a certain way, which can actually have a very important impact in the future. So what we talk about in the private sector, which is maybe changing your process or perhaps your product a little bit, your offering, could actually have a huge impact at the end of the day in terms of the outcomes, of the social outcomes. And that is hugely under-measured at present. I think there have been huge attempts now to measure public sector productivity a bit better, but there are still problems in terms of comparing ourselves across other countries as to what type of methodology we really should be using there.
Many thanks indeed, Vicky. I guess the corollary to that is sort of Andy Haldane complaining about lack of hard economic data. Well, Michael Gove, clearly, in terms of for the local government audience here, we're not going to get the audit commission back anytime soon, but assessing relative local authority performance is something where there is a bit of a hole. And how do you measure innovation when you don't have the wherewithal to calculate this? So we're coming up to the final 5 minutes. We're going to end bang on time. People have screens and other commitments to get to. So what I'll do is I've got a final question, one specifically addressed to you, Chris, from Peter Hayden. He says, you mentioned the West Midlands MTC, but what about engineering excellence at Loughborough? I remember Brush. Has that culture been maintained? Can you quickly respond to Peter?
Peter will be very pleased to hear that it is still alive and kicking.
Well answered, sir. Thank you very much. So final thoughts and reflections. Somebody's posted, look, is there the danger in that local innovation successes where they exist might be hijacked as levelling up successes when essentially they've been oven baked already, all the hard work's gone in? Is there, well, what is the danger? a success is a success, no matter who's badging it. Is that a problem? And do you have any sort of final passing thoughts and comments on what we've discussed today before I switch off at 12 exactly? Conrad, you've got your hand up as the first willing contributor. Over to you first.
Yeah, I'll try not to take too much time. I was just going to pick up on the point about, you know, claiming success. I think that would be a great thing if we did that, candidly. I think often, you know, there is a siloed mentality, and actually, why wouldn't we claim this as both you know, an innovation success and a levelling up success? In fact, I remember, I mean, it was about 18 months ago now, Boris Johnson, on a conference I was at, explicitly said, if we want to level up, we have to scale up. The two are intertwined. So I think it will be a great thing, actually, to get more success and more joining up around these things, rather than trying to take a more siloed view.
Many thanks, Conrad. Joe, do you see any danger in gold diggers or glory hunters in Cumbria?
No, absolutely not. You know, success has many fathers, failure is an orphan. And I think we should all remember that. Some of my greatest successes are things that are claimed proudly by others. And I think that's a real result, because everyone is sharing in the ownership and the commitment to make it happen and deliver. So I don't think it's a risk. I think it's an opportunity.
Many thanks, Joe. Any sort of final thoughts, reflections, Vicky or Chris, before we pack up?
Well, from my side, I'd say, of course, I agree entirely. I mean, after all, when productivity suddenly goes up or we're doing reasonably well in one area, it is quite often because businesses have made various decisions. But of course, those decisions are made within the context of whatever policy environment there is. So they're all interlinked. Yes, so I have absolutely no problem with that, as long as it is recognized, and that whatever it is that you're doing as a government, for example, doesn't offset some of what is going on locally as well, and doesn't discourage it. That's always a danger.
Many thanks, Vicky. Final word over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much. Innovation, I mean, it's difficult to discuss it fully in an hour. I mean, innovation is part of our heritage, it's part of our DNA, and it will be very much part of our future. It needs attention, it needs investment, and it needs far more discussion about where we should go to deliver this global, scientific, wonderful superpower. And innovation is going to be right at the heart of that.
Many thanks indeed, Chris, and many thanks to all our panelists, Joe, Conrad, Vicky, and thanks to you for attending today's policy webinar. We will record it, post it to YouTube for future generations of people watching YouTube clips about local innovation. You never know, there might be a strong audience for this. Sincere gratitude also to our colleagues at PA Consulting. We're taking the show on the road to Harrogate for the Local Government Association conference, and we're having a drinks reception to drink the spirit of ingenuity at the Sun Pavilion next Wednesday evening. Details from our website. So sincere thanks to everyone for contributing to what I thought was a very rich, strong debate, taking up the mantle, how do we deliver innovation at place. I hope for all our sakes that we start seriously addressing the productivity problems which only local innovation and ingenuity can unlock, as Joe's doing with your ecosystem in Cumbria, and Chris, as you're working in the West Midlands. On behalf of everyone at Localis and PA Consulting, thank you very much, and we hope to see you at a future webinar in the future. Otherwise, log off, go to your next screen meeting or lunch, or if you're working from home, enjoy the sunshine, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.